That's right. We're at the Ambrosetti conference here in northern Italy on Lake Como. It's all about policing the banks and securing stable financial growth here in Europe. And as you say, we are joined by Markus Brunnermeier from Princeton University, one of the foremost experts on financial regulation. Let me ask you first about what you make of these stress tests in Ireland. Were they stressful enough?
I think it's a very good first step. Or essentially, you need to bring more transparency and clarity in the situation, and bringing especially new capital to the banks and merging them is a good thing to do.
Portugal yesterday announced that their budget deficit last year was actually 8.6% of GDP, and that they had missed that 7% target. What's going on?
I think whether you miss this target is whether it can be because you spend too much, but it can also be because the GDP growth is not there.
And that's what you think the problem is?
The bigger problem in the long run will be to really get the GDP growth growing again, so that it gets off the ground. And for this, it might be necessary that you do some restructuring in some form in order to get the whole thing off the ground again.
We're seeing this interesting situation where Portuguese yields continue to go up, while, say, Spain, where the yields on bonds sort of rose in sync with Portuguese bonds, are going down. Why is that happening?
I think that's a very healthy development. Essentially, there's a decoupling between the Portuguese yield and the Spanish yield. And that's because the Spanish stress test, the first stress test, was actually very tough, and it was much clearer, and it led to a recapitalization of many of the cajas. And this way, more trust and confidence came back to the Spanish system.
You think the bondholders got it right? You don't think that they're missing something in Spain?
I think they got it right. It's correct to have some confidence in the Spanish situation, and this allows them to avoid any contagion from Portugal to Spain, and that's a big plus for Europe as a whole.
Quick question on Greece. We heard yesterday that Greece's budget deficit as a percentage of GDP may reach 10, higher than initially thought for last year. What should we make of that?
So the Greece situation is the same problem, that you need the growth coming back. So just cutting spending is one way. You have to restructure your spending and you have to make the economy more efficient, but the growth has to come back. That's the key in order to survive in the long run.
The taxpayers in both the cases of Ireland and Greece have basically taken the hit on this, haven't they? I mean, it's not the stakeholders in the banks themselves. Is that right?
So there has to be a fair balance. So on the one hand, the investor should contribute something, and on the other hand, also the taxpayer has to contribute something. I think it's not fair that only the taxpayer has to contribute to the whole thing, so there should be a fair balance between both groups to take appropriate hits.
Going forward, we're going to have more stress tests in continental Europe. Is what we saw in Ireland the right model for the rest of the countries?
I think what's very important is that you have the right stress scenario, and this stress scenario has to include also some sovereign defaults. Otherwise, the market will never believe it. One has to be cautious not to imply certain sovereign defaults.
But you think that sovereign default in Greece and, say, Portugal is inevitable?
I wouldn't say inevitable, but I would not rule it out. And if you have a stress scenario which rules out any sovereign default, then it's not credible. And this doesn't bring transparency back to the marketplace. A
default would be the one way to preserve, or restructuring the debts. You think that's the way to sort of preserve the stability of the banks and growth?
So restructuring will probably hurt the banks, but there are different ways you can do restructuring. There might be some ways by extending the maturity and other ways which will hurt the banks less than just introducing some haircut. There are some creative ways to do this, and which might be less hurtful than just cutting off some haircut.
Professor Markus Brunnermeier, thank you very much for joining us. One of the foremost experts on policing the banks and financial regulation there from Princeton University. And of course, we'll be live here all day on Lake Como at the Ambrosetti conference, talking about, among other things, of course, Europe's very own sovereign debt crisis.